Let's make it even more complicated. You can also have patients who have mosaic sex chromosome disorders. So for example, you can have individuals where some of their cells have a single X and some have two. These people usually have milder symptoms than Turner syndrome, and they're more likely to be fertile. So this could result from perhaps the zygote, right after fertilization was technically XX, but maybe during early embryonic development, there was an issue during cell division where one set of cells didn't get the appropriate number of X chromosomes. What if you had an issue during during mitosis in the early embryo where some of the cells didn't get the Y they were expecting? So this could be ambiguous genitalia, short stature, infertility, variable gender identity. You can also have individuals where the zygote actually has Klinefelter. It carries the trisomy, but during mitosis, it corrected itself in some cells. So you have some cells that have the normal complement of chromosomes and some that have too many X's. We here usually see milder symptoms than Klinefelter, but also decreased fertility still. And so that's, some of the differences we can see in people's sex determination and sex development. And I think that gets to some of the broader considerations, and I just kind of gave you that example of, athletics, but, we can talk about these terms where we have the biological sex of an individual. But then when we're talking about biological sex, what are we actually talking about? Are you talking about the chromosomes? XX, XY, but what about variations? Are you talking about the gonads? Do we have testes? Do we have ovaries? Do we have some sort of kind of ambiguous type of gonad? What hormones does this person produce? Primarily estrogen or testosterone? Or do they have testosterone that gets converted to estrogen? And then we have anatomy. Is there a penis? Is there a vagina? Is it not actually clear? So even though, people like to talk about sex as if it's this very easily defined thing, and to be fair, for the majority of people on the planet, sex is very easy to define. For the majority of people on the planet who have XX, they develop ovaries, they produce estrogen, they have a vagina, we would call them female. The majority of people who have XY are going to have testes, produce a lot of testosterone, have a penis, and we would call them male. But what I wanted to emphasize is that there are people who are different, and it's not a 1 in a million type of difference. The other thing that people talk about and sometimes get confused is sex versus gender. So in sex, we're talking about biology. Gender is, people say gender is a social construct. Gender is their individual personal sense of who they are. That would be their gender identity. But gender is more of like the societal expectations because of your sex or your perceived sex. And so here's an example of sex versus gender. So in the middle are the things that we would define as sex, right? The chromosomes, XX is female, XY is male. Do you have ovaries, fallopian tubes, and a uterus? Female. Do you have a penis, testes? You're male. Do you produce estrogen? Do you produce testosterone, right? Female, male. But now, what does that have to do with maybe the perception in society? Well, Often females are seen as, caring, and you get service jobs. Like women are kindergarten teachers and nurses. Right? We take care of people, and we're fragile, and we're emotional, and you have to take care of us because we get sad. And it is well known that females, or I guess in terms of gender, we would say women, right? Women receive usually inferior health care. There have been numerous studies shown that women's pain is not taken nearly as seriously as male pain. A really classic example is when women are getting an IUD as a type of birth control. There's no pain management given, right? They're just like, here, let me put this little thing up your cervix and good luck. Like, that's not a painful procedure. But men who get a vasectomy, let's baby you a little bit. Women who turn up with pain are sometimes seen as hysterical or overreacting. And there are lots of situations where in a heterosexual relationship, women can end up financially dependent on men. Again, you talk about the gender pay gap and all of that. Who's expected to be the stay-at-home parent, right? All of those gender expectations because of the perceived biological sex. And then on the other hand, males are strong and they do things like construction and they can be doctors. They're seen as more risk-taking and aggressive. And it's very well known that in general, males have higher workforce participation. They don't experience the same career setbacks as we see when they have children, and they tend to have more financial autonomy. Of course, there are exceptions to everything, right? But in general, that's what we mean by sex versus gender. Like, why does testosterone mean that you should be able to make more money where you work? And then we can get even more complicated and more controversial if you want. We can talk about gender identity, which is how you perceive your own gender. Again, the majority of people are cisgender. Cis is a prefix that means same. So the gender identity matches the biological sex. So in my case, I would be cisgender. I am biologically female, and I feel like I don't have any problem with that. I understand. I am a woman, that's fine. Or if you are biologically male and you're like, I'm a man, that's fine, right? And that's what the majority of people experience with their gender identity. People who are transgender have a gender identity that is different from their biological sex. They don't identify, in terms of what they want to be socially and how they want to be perceived by others. They don't identify with their biological sex. So this would be a case where somebody may be biologically female but feels and identifies more as male. And I'm probably simplifying that because I can't speak to that personal experience because I don't have it, but as simply as I can, that's kind of how I would explain it. And then there are people who are non-binary, where of course they do have most often a classic biological sex. They were either born male or born female. I'm not talking about intersex people at this point. I'm just talking about, male versus female. And the way they perceive their own gender doesn't really fit either of those classic boxes of male versus female. And then gender expression is how an individual expresses what they feel as their gender. And so males might do stereotypical male things, like perhaps they express their gender through having facial hair, having short hair, maybe trying to have a more muscular physique, wearing clothes that are male designed, right? Whatever. It's supposed to fit for men, right? They wear men's clothes. Women might wear makeup. Maybe they have longer hair. Or they have short hair because they're like, man, it's exhausting to have long hair, so they might have short hair too. But maybe they wear makeup. Perhaps they wear dresses. They, might try to have more of a feminine look to their body versus, a masculine look. Or sometimes people don't want to fit either of those categories and they might try to be a little bit more androgynous. But again, when you're talking about sex and talking about gender, it can be very, very complicated. And we can also talk about, medical considerations. In the past, if a child had ambiguous genitalia, they would have surgery done, like as an infant, to correct the appearance. And this often led to, later psychological consequences. And so for this section, I'm having you read an article about a child who was not born intersex, was actually born male, but due to a botched circumcision, ended up being surgically turned into a female and raised as a female, and the psychological issues that result. And so, of course, not all examples are going to be that extreme, but, how do you make a decision for an infant about what genitals they should have without more information? And so current practices when children are born with ambiguous genitalia is, individualized care. So you consider that child as their own patient, not as, someone just part of a group. Maybe don't do surgery right away. See how they develop. And multidisciplinary teams. You get geneticists involved. Okay, what do the chromosomes say? Is there a mutation somewhere? What endocrinologists, like what hormones are there? Right? What effect will that have if they're, producing a lot of testosterone? Do we give them a vagina or do we give them a penis? Right? Psychologists to not only deal with the fact that they're, not going to look like the other kids, but also to, kind of help figure out how is this person developing. And so I gave you an example. I said, 1 in 2,000 are born with one of these kind of chromosomal conditions. This statistic is even higher, that up to 1.7% of babies are born with sex characteristics that don't fit the definition of male and female. This makes being intersex as common as being a redhead. So there are, a lot of people born every day who maybe don't fit our classic definitions of male and female. And so then we can think about, some of the ethical and legal issues. What about informed consent? When you make a medical decision for an infant, they don't have a choice. And maybe when you're talking about things that are emergencies, like, hey, my child is going to die without open heart surgery, yeah, I'm not going to give them a choice. But in terms of their genitals, as long as they have a functioning urinary tract, does it matter what their genitals look like when they're infants or small children? They're not really using them for that. They're just there. So do you, give them as the next steps as bodily autonomy? Do you give them the option to choose as they get a little bit older? You can think about the right to privacy. At what point is it an individual's right or responsibility? Do they have a responsibility to disclose any sort of variation? When you send a child to daycare or send a child to school, right? What option do those children have? And of course, cultural sensitivity. Various cultures have really different views on sex and gender diversity. Different religions have different views on sex and gender diversity. And again, like I said earlier, I'm not trying to change anybody's mind. I'm not trying to tell you what your opinion should or should not be. I'm giving you the facts behind the science, and then you can use your own cultural, religious, personal views to decide your opinions on those matters. And I think it's important to acknowledge that even if we don't agree with people, that, people do have a right to their own opinion. We can talk about legal protections. If a child is born with ambiguous genitalia and, the parent says, okay, well, this is my boy, we're going to give him a penis and we're going to raise him as a boy. What if that boy grows up and is like, actually, I'm a girl? Maybe, the parents, the physicians didn't make the right choice. How easy is it to change a gender marker? Or what if somebody is transgender and their gender identity doesn't match their biological sex? At what point, legally are they allowed to, get a new driver's license, get a new passport? So what this map shows you is in blue are all of the countries that will allow you as an individual to change your gender marker. Orange and red and yellow will allow changes in gender marker if people have chromosomal disorders and things like that. And then, of course, there's the social challenge. I think regardless of whether or not you agree with various gender identities, again, it doesn't matter if you agree or not, there are people who have different gender identities. And, it doesn't matter whether or not you think that's right or wrong, people exist who are different. But they do experience discrimination, bullying, violence, higher rates of suicide, and barriers to healthcare access. So there's a lot of issues that can come up around sex, gender identity. And then as a last little bit of fun, I wanted to talk about how other systems have sex determination. So beyond, the XXXY system. So there's a ZW system that we see in birds, some reptiles, some insects, and some fish. ZW is female, ZZ is male. So in this case, the female actually has the two different sex chromosomes where the male doesn't. He has two of the same. There's a system called XO, which in humans would be like Turner syndrome, and that would be female. But instead, having two X's means you're female, having only one means you're male. There are some real funky ones, like temperature, so environmental systems. So, for example, in turtles, if the eggs are above a certain temperature during incubation, the offspring will be female. If the eggs are incubated at a cooler temperature, they'll be male. Alligators are the opposite. If the eggs are at a warmer temperature, they'll be male. If they're at a cooler temperature, they'll be female. And there are some where if the eggs are at either a very cool or a very warm temperature, they'll be female. But if they're at more of a middle temperature, they'll be male. So you have all of these differences here. Then you can have things like haploid versus diploid, which would be some of your colonial insects like bees, ants, and wasps. If the insect has only one set of chromosomes, it's a male. If it has two sets of chromosomes, it's a female. We have hermaphrodites, which would include some fish, snails, and worms. This is where individuals have both male and female functioning reproductive systems. So sometimes the individual can fertilize itself, or sometimes the individual will cross-fertilize. And in that, we also have sequential hermaphrodites. Clownfish, like Nemo, they're all born male, but a dominant individual can become female. A fish called wrasse, they start as female, but they can become male if they are the dominant female. So again, there's social and environmental systems, again, like fish. Many species can also change back and forth. So then I think about like Finding Nemo, where they're clownfish, right? So Nemo's a boy, and that's like normal because clownfish are born male. But the dad is still male. So the dad, and he's kind of a worrywart, right? The dad in Finding Nemo, that's probably why he never became female, because he's not a dominant individual. So Pixar had it right. And then there are systems that don't use sex chromosomes. They use genic sex determination. Some plants, some fish, some reptiles. There are no sex chromosomes, but the presence of specific alleles at various locations is what would determine sex of the organism. So hopefully you found that interesting. Sex determination is a lot more complicated than people usually think.